Hey, friends and listeners of the Switch for Good podcast. Yep, that's you. I have some really exciting news. Dotsie and I have started a Switch for Good podcast Facebook group. We created it so we can build a community of fans that will help us improve the show and deliver on the topics that you want to learn more about. So we want to hear what your favorite content is, what you want more of, and what you want less of. And if you like the length of the show, Dotsie and I are always talking about the length of the show, right, Dotsie?
Yes.
We want to tailor our show around the needs and desires of our incredible listeners, almost 500,000 of you. And it's really simple to join. Just go to our Switch for Good Facebook page. That's Switch, the number 4, and then Good. And then click on groups. And there we are, the Switch for Good podcast chat. You can post directly in the group, share ideas, talk to other listeners, and connect with like-minded folks. So go, run, join our Facebook group and tell us what you want. Hello and welcome to the Switch for Good podcast. I'm Alexandra Paul and I'm here with Dotsie Bausch. Hi, Dotsie.
Hi there.
So Dotsie, I wanted to tell you, we like to talk about things that help people, but we also want them to know a little bit about our lives too. And this is the story that I have today is maybe a good intersection for that. It's actually more about Ian, but my husband, Ian, who is, as you know, Dotsie, is an excellent athlete. He's a triathlon coach. He's very fit at age 52, but he wants to lose 10 pounds because he had a hip replacement about 7 weeks ago, and he hasn't been able to work out with any vigor for, well, at least the 7 weeks, for 5 weeks after the surgery. And then for several months before the surgery, his hip was bothering him so much, so he wasn't working out a lot. So he inevitably gained weight. And when I say inevitably, not really inevitably, because as we know, diet is 80% of your weight loss or gain. It's really more important that you keep your diet tight. But Ian, being a man who's always exercised a lot, has never really had to restrict his diet. So when he became sedentary because of this hip for a couple months, he did not restrict his diet. He might have even eaten more because, he was in pain.
You got more time.
He was in pain too, and he wasn't, his food was a solace. But because he's not into diet fads, he's a really good role model, I think, for folks who are listening to understand that everyone deals with weight stuff at some point in their life where the balance might go off a little, where they can't eat as healthily or they can't exercise as much. So just to understand that you and I and Kirk and Ian, we don't just magically come here and we can eat quote unquote whatever we want, because if we ate a diet of junk food, we would gain weight inevitably, right? So anyway, so Ian wants to lose 10 pounds, sorry. And the first thing he's doing for that is he's writing his food down, because studies show that people who write their food down will lose weight more effectively. And actually, especially for people who've lost weight and want to maintain that, because as we know, maintenance is the hardest thing especially if you've been overweight for a while. So writing your food down is key to maintaining weight. But Ian probably won't do it after he's lost his 10 pounds, because his weight is very comfortable 10 pounds lighter. But if you've been overweight for a while, your set point is maybe that higher weight, and it will take a while for your body not to fight to get back to that weight, for it to accept the lower weight. So you should continue to write your food down for a little bit just to stay accountable. And Ian's using the app Chronometer, which is I recommend that app, but there's a lot of other apps out there. And the second strategy that he's doing is just not having treats in the house that he likes. And his are peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and cereal are two things that he tends to go to. So he's just said, you know what, I'm not going to have that in the house. And I have clients who really struggle because people in their families eat junk food, and my client has to struggle with, seeing that junk food in the house. And luckily, I don't like cereal or peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, so he doesn't have to worry about that. So we just have taken all that stuff out of the house. And thirdly, he is also, and this is an interesting one, he's not going to places that have some of the foods that he likes. So he's not tempting himself. So I recommend for people who've gotten into a really bad habit of going to a grocery store for their weekly shopping and also always buying some treats, go to another store. Start where you don't know exactly where those treats are in the store, and start buying healthy things in that grocery store. And so you'll associate it with only that, and you won't be be habitually unawarely reaching for unhealthy food. And then the last thing that he's doing is he's sharing with me what he eats, mostly because he says, hold on, Alexandra, I've got to write down my food. And we laugh about it because Dotsy, I've been writing down my food for months. Like, it makes me feel safe. Like, okay, I've written it down. And so it's a weird thing with me, but Ian's not nearly as weird. It's become a joke. And he's probably just going to take a couple months to lose this 10 pounds. But so he tells me what he eats, and that helps him stay on. So
these are great tips from our resident health coach, Alexandra Paul. I first of all, you've made me hungry for a PB&J. I do like them, and I haven't had one in a really long time, so I'm going to go make one. And then I like the store suggestion. Yeah. Because right when you said that, I thought there's this one store that it's the only place I found that have dark chocolate covered walnuts, which are totally fine and safe and delicious. And I have them sometimes, but they come in a pretty large tub, sort of fresh packed. You know how you can't go to the bulk section anymore because of COVID, right? They already have it pre-done. So usually I would go get 10 dark chocolate covered walnuts and then just have one or night. Well, now I've got to get it in the big old plastic thing, which the plastic's bad. And then I end up eating quite a few every night instead of one or two. So I'm going to just kind of divert myself from that store maybe for a bit until the bulk section comes back and I can buy the amount that is safe for me to buy.
Right. Actually, that's a really good tip, Dotsy, that buying in bulk, we often buy the bigger containers because we think we're saving money, but actually we tend to eat those faster. So in the end, we might not be saving money because we eat more of them each time because it's such a big tub. Just like if you eat on a larger plate, you'll tend to put more. Dotsy, introduce our guest today. He's amazing. We're very lucky to have him.
Will do. Gene Baur is the pioneer of farm animal sanctuaries. He co-founded the first farm sanctuary in 1986, somewhat ironically, on a tofu farm, and grew it to a bicoastal operation that now cares for over 1,000 rescued animals. Gene has worked tirelessly for the animals, from selling meatless hot dogs at the Grateful Dead concerts in the late 80s to co-leading legislative efforts to reduce the suffering of farm animals. He's also a prolific speaker, author, and named the conscience of the food movement by Time magazine. I first met Gene at a conference where we were both on a panel together about 4 years ago. I was pretty new to the movement and was definitely a bit starstruck meeting Gene for the first time. On that day, Gene was carrying around the very first ear tag from the very first animal he ever rescued, a sheep named Hilda. I was carrying around my Olympic medal, and I was so enamored with Hilda's ear tag, which still brings tears to my eyes, as you can hear, and the meaning, the deep meaning behind her tag and her legacy, that I asked Gene if he would trade Hilda's tag for my Olympic medal, and he said no. Hilda's story is one of my favorite rescue stories of all time. And Gene, we are so honored to have you on the podcast, and we would love to start out with you sharing Hilda's story with our listeners.
Wow, well, that's such a kind introduction, and thank you, and for remembering Hilda too, and her ear tag, which I often carry. So in the early days of Farm Sanctuary in the 1980s, we spent a lot of time visiting farms and stockyards and slaughterhouses to document conditions. And our thinking was, if we could show people what was happening and people saw how badly these animals were treated, they would immediately not want to support factory farming and everybody would go vegan. So that was our kind of naive belief and hope at the time. But we investigated places to document what was happening so we could show people and educate people. And from time to time, we would find animals in horrible conditions that were just discarded like garbage. And that was the case with Hilda. She was too sick to walk, so she was literally discarded on a pile of dead animals behind the stockyard. And as we approached this dead pile, there were dead cows and dead pigs and dead sheep. The maggots were so thick you could hear them buzzing. And then off of this dead pile, this one sheep lifts her head. And we were stunned that a living animal would be discarded this way. So took her off the dead pile, brought her to a veterinarian thinking she'd have to be euthanized, but she ended up recovering and living with us for more than 10 years. And so, one of the magical things that happens at Farm Sanctuary is that animals who had been seen as commodities or just pieces of meat, literally, they're seen as, meat on the hoof, or seen as discards, as nothing but products, become individuals, become people in a sense. And so, Hilda's ear tag is a number, and that was removed, and now she has a name. And that is, I think, fundamental to what we do at Farm Sanctuary. We see these animals as individuals, as sentient creatures, not as commodities. And so that ear tag is, the first time, officially, that one of these individuals became our friend instead of being seen as a commodity in the food system.
Did anything shift inside you in that moment when she raised her head? I mean, you're already totally hyper crazy vegan. You knew a lot about what goes on behind closed doors. I can just imagine looking over and seeing that head lift up. Did anything shift in your soul? What did that feel like when you saw her lift her head?
It was sort of mixed feelings because, as you say, I was pretty aware of how bad things were, and had been to the stockyard a number of times. I'd been to the dead pile a number of times and seen carcasses. But it was the first time that a living animal moved and was left on that dead pile. And so it was sort of shock. And what my feeling was, how bad can it get that a living animal would be discarded like garbage? So there was that feeling. And then you just sort of kick into gear and say, can we help this one? Can we do something to provide care? We assumed that she would have to be euthanized. It wasn't even necessarily, let's rescue her and give her a good life. It was just get her off the dead pile. And then we went to a vet, and it was hard to find a veterinarian to look at her, but we finally did. And she by the end of the day, she was standing. So she was not in that bad a shape, thankfully. And I think what probably happened was she was on a truck that was overcrowded, and it was in the summer. It was very hot, so she probably passed out from heat exhaustion. And it had rained, which probably helped cool her off. And so she ended up recovering, thankfully. But my feelings were it was some of the same stuff, just how bad it is, but something different where, again, there's this live animal and we need to either relieve the suffering or try to help. And thankfully she recovered and had a good long life.
This was the mid 1980s, and I recall, a lot of our listeners might not have been part of the animal rights movement or known about it back then, but it seemed to me that it was more focused on labs back then and not so much on farms. Yet you found yourself on a stockyard and in farms documenting to try and get people to be aware of what's going on with these animals. Tell us a little bit about the animal rights movement then and where you fit in. What did it look like?
That's exactly right. Back in the mid 80s, a lot of the focus was on inhumane research on animals, like laboratory research. And there were exposés of the cruelty of these research labs. And there was break-ins in some cases and videotapes released. And we felt that farm animals, also needed to be in people's minds, and people needed to see what was happening there. So that was part of our intention early on, was to actually go in, investigate, and document, very similar to what was happening with laboratory animals. And at the time, there was not a lot of attention being focused on what happened to animals exploited for food. So we felt that was an area that needed attention, and that's why Farm Sanctuary started.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you became a man who cared about animals? We read a little bit about your environmental ethic that came from living in LA and seeing the sprawl and how that linked to your understanding, and before that, veal and chicken on your plate. So tell us a little bit about the Gene Baur of the, early 80s?
Yeah. Well, I, grew up in Hollywood. I was born in '62, so I grew up during like the Vietnam War, and I just saw lots of like violence on TV. In the neighborhood where my parents lived, I saw houses that were being made bigger and trees being cut down, and I saw animals like deer, for example, being hit by cars. And I just sort of grew up seeing all this harm human beings were causing to each other, such as in war, to the earth, and also to wild animals. And I first learned about animals who suffer in the food industry from my grandmother, who told me about how veal calves are raised. So in high school, I said, I'm never eating veal. But growing up, I just didn't want to participate in such violence and abuse. And I didn't want to be a cog in a wheel of a system causing so much harm. So I was always sort of figuring out how I could be a voice against some of these problems. And, in high school and college, I got involved with environmental groups, with human rights groups. I started learning more about factory farming. Also in high school, I had an image of the fact that I was eating other animals. I had come home from something and my mother made a chicken dinner and I saw this dead body on the plate. An animal with legs and wings attached on his or her back. And I did not eat chicken that night. And, for much of high school, I was sort of didn't eat a lot of meat, but then that memory kind of faded as time went. And then in college, I started learning more and remembering these things and just learning about how massive a problem factory farming is and how, so I didn't like the cruelty. I didn't like the environmental impacts. But I didn't know that it was possible to live without eating animals. I grew up believing you needed meat, for protein or in milk for calcium, like all of us. But when I learned that it was possible to live without eating those products, I went vegan. That was in 1985. And then I also felt that most people would also want to know about this and would also rather not support this abusive industry. So that's when we started doing these investigations to try to expose what was happening. And again, we sort of hoped that if people saw this, they would stop supporting meat, dairy, and egg production and start eating plants instead of animals. And since then, I've really come to understand just how much more complex it is and how systemically we need to deal with infrastructures. We need to deal with not only economic systems but belief systems, and it's a much bigger structural issue than just each person making a change, although that can happen. But I think significant change is going to require some structural shifts as well.
Yeah. You mentioned the veal industry. What are some of the major changes that you've seen over your long period of being in this movement and all the work that you've done? How has it changed the
Yeah,
veal industry?
well, in some cases, like in the case of the veal industry, for example, I think consumer awareness has actually made a difference. And people don't like the idea of eating a calf who has been chained by the neck in a crate for his whole life. And even, again, my grandmother told me about this when I was in high school. But since then, there'd been lots of education as well. And veal consumption did start decreasing, partly because of awareness among consumers. So that was really good to see. And we have worked on legislation to outlaw veal crates, again, where these animals are confined in a 2-foot wide crate, chained by the neck their whole lives. And so we've had some progress there to outlaw that most extreme confinement. But what is happening now in the veal industry is that these calves are given a little bit more space, but they're still not given good lives, and then they're still killed young. And something to understand about the veal industry is that it is actually literally born out of the dairy industry. For a cow to have milk, she, like other mammals, have to give birth and then they start lactating to feed their babies. But in the dairy industry, the babies are taken away at birth so that the cow's milk can be sold to humans. The female calves are raised to become milking cows, but the males are useless to the dairy industry. So the veal industry was created to take advantage of this plentiful supply of unwanted male calves in the dairy industry. Mm-hmm. So that's how the veal industry started, to take this unwanted byproduct and to use these calves and make money off of them. Now, in addition to raising consumer awareness and opposition to veal, Another thing that has happened is that the dairy industry has done research on using these male calves for beef. When I was at Cornell University, they were actually doing research there on male Holstein calves, which is the primary dairy breed, to see if they could be good beef animals, profitable. Mm-hmm. And so there has now been a shift where some of these Holstein calves are being raised for beef. So the veal industry is not the main place now where these unwanted male calves are going. A lot of them are now going for beef production. And if you drive by Harris Ranch, in California, you'll now see not just your traditional beef breeds, you'll also oftentimes see Holsteins, these dairy animals, who are now being used for beef as well as for veal.
Mm-hmm. I think when we speak about, people just have such a hard time with the concept of eating a baby. I know, 20 years ago or 25 years ago, if I'd asked people about that, because I was one of those people, oh, no, I don't eat veal. And it's important to highlight that all the animals we're eating are babies. Chickens at about 5 to 6 weeks, they're killed, sometimes even earlier. Pigs right around 6 months. So they're all babies. And
that's exactly right. These animals are killed very young. They're not allowed to grow old. And it's sad. And most people don't realize that. Absolutely. So it's important for people to know.
I want to just clarify that the reason that and correct me if I'm wrong, Jean, that the reason that these calves are not able to move and they're put in such small crates is because people think or felt that the meat was more delectable if it didn't have a lot of muscle and gristle, and they also didn't feed the animals iron, right? Mm-hmm. But now with some of the rules, especially here in California, that mandate 43 square feet for each calf, which is a lot different than 2. What is that going to do to the veal industry? And does it really change the taste of the meat? Is it?
Yes. Well, I think that there has been a shift away from the anemic diets also. Part of, as you say, the reasoning behind putting these calves in these crates and feeding them this diet that was deficient in iron was to have pale, soft meat. And if they're not exercising, then the muscles don't develop. And if they're being fed a diet deficient in iron, the muscles tend to be more white as opposed to red. Sometimes these calves, and I've seen this, when they're being loaded out from the veal barn onto the slaughterhouse truck, have a hard time walking because they have not walked and because they are so weak, because their muscles have not developed. So some people have believed that pale, white, soft flesh was desirable. And that was part of the whole veal industry for a while, yes. And I think it has moved a little bit beyond that now. And I think that the diets have been more refined, where they may still be inadequate in not providing the nutrients these animals need, but they're not as bad as they used to be. And I'd also say that the animals are given more space, still not exercising, still not running, still not developing muscles, but still not given a good life. And so the veal industry has shifted. But what often happens in the veal industry or in any form of animal agriculture is that when there are shifts to make things less bad, that the industry is going to market them as if they've made these massive breakthroughs, which they have not done. So veal calves, and again, the veal industry is not as prominent as it used to be. A lot of these calves are now going more towards beef. Some of these shifts are business oriented. If a dairy farm, for example, can sell a calf to several different buyers, the price tends to go up, and then that makes it less desirable for them to go to the veal industry, which used to be the primary buyer, right? So things have changed economically as well that have affected the veal industry. But the bottom line is that these, at Farm Sanctuary, all of these animals are living, feeling creatures, and they deserve to be treated with respect. And treating animals less bad is certainly better than animals being treated more bad, but it's not good, right? So there's been some shifts, and those are positive. I mean, the fact that there are shifts tells us, I think, that people care and they don't want these animals to suffer. And I think if we follow that reasoning to its logical conclusion, it means we're going to start seeing, hopefully, people eating less animals and then maybe no animals. But it's an ongoing process that's continuing.
I think a lot of people don't know that the babies in the dairy industry, especially in California or in other parts of the country, they often get a little more space. But in California, it's only 32 inches by 56 inches, a hutch in which they're kept for at least 2 months, where they can't move either. It's a little bit wider than what the veal calves, but not by much at all. It's amazing that I think the veal industry and the foie gras industry kind of provided an in for people like Dotsie and me who cared about animals. So those were our first steps. Like my mother, she in the 70s, no foie gras. And veal too was something that we did not eat because of that. But we had meat and chicken and all that other stuff. But it helped give us a consciousness that there was something fishy going on, no pun intended, in the industries.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Those images of what those animals were experiencing, reaching people, I think had a big effect. And I think, pigs in gestation crates, is another example now, or chickens in battery cages. These are other examples, I think, of showing people just how bad it is, and then working for reforms to make it less bad. But hopefully during the process, a growing awareness about farm animals as living, feeling creatures is rising up. And with that sort of thinking, if you want to be rational about it, right? If we can live without causing unnecessary harm, I think most people would like that. It leads us, obviously to this idea of not eating animals.
Yeah. What was the spark for you, or the impetus to say, I want to rescue animals and create a sanctuary for them? Was Hilda that inspiration, or was Farm Sanctuary already there and you took her there?
Yeah, well, Farm Sanctuary existed as an organization, but we were living in a row house in Delaware and we didn't have a sanctuary. So the impetus for Farm Sanctuary really at first was to expose the abuses, to get in there and document the conditions. And then we found Hilda, who I would say was the impetus for the sanctuary, because now we had an animal who we needed to take care of.
And she couldn't live in the row house properly.
She couldn't. So that's when the Adopt a Farm Animal program began as well. So we rescued animals, rehabilitated them, found homes, and then a tofu farmer in Pennsylvania let us use some of his land. We lived in a school bus on the tofu farm for a couple of years. And then we finally got the farm in Watkins Glen, New York in 1989. And that still exists. And that's our, first permanent sanctuary. But we started out with this idea of exposing the abuses, thinking that consumers would decide not to support animal cruelty, and then found living animals left for dead on piles of dead animals or in trash cans, started rescuing them, and that's how the sanctuaries began. Mm-hmm. And after being in New York for a while, we opened one in California. Now there are hundreds of sanctuaries around the world, which is great. But I would also say that sanctuaries are not able to rescue nearly the amount of animals who need to be helped. So we need to be careful about that and not get overwhelmed as sanctuaries, because we sort of face this ethical impossibility, because ethically we must rescue them all, and we can't. Even if we rescued literally 1 million animals a year, and we can't do that, but even if we could, it'd be a drop in the bucket. So ultimately, I think sanctuaries and the animals who are able to come live at the sanctuaries, set an example. The animals are ambassadors. The animals are our friends, not our food. And then ultimately, we want people to come to know these animals as individuals, not as commodities, not as edibles, and start living in a way that doesn't cause unnecessary harm. So the sanctuaries play a role, but sanctuaries also can get overwhelmed with animal rescue. And that is something that, we're constantly trying to raise awareness about, that, rescue is important, but it's only part of the bigger picture.
Yeah. I know I've certainly heard you speak, and I know that you're especially horrified by the treatment of downed animals, which, first of all, I think would be helpful if you were to explain what that even means to our listeners. But there's a heartbreaking story of you trying to get a farm to euthanize a downed cow. You were there, who was moaning in pain, and they wouldn't do it. Would you also share that story with us, and why on earth they wouldn't euthanize her?
Yeah. Well, when we first started, we did a lot of investigations, and often we would come across downed animals. And these are animals that are too sick even to stand and walk. And they would sometimes just be left in alleyways or in pens. Sometimes, like Hilda, they would be thrown on piles of dead animals, just discarded like garbage. And we felt that this needed to change, that animals who were too sick to walk should either be humanely euthanized or given proper veterinary care to be made healthy. They should not be left to die. They should not be dragged onto trucks and taken to slaughter. So our No Downers campaign was one of our first efforts. We had demonstrations and protests at stockyards calling for no downer policies, where they would not market and sell downed animals. If a downed animal was sent to the stockyard, they would either be euthanized or given proper veterinary care. And so we were able to pass a couple of laws, including one in California. But before we passed the California law, I did investigations all over the state. I went to stockyards, I went to slaughterhouses, I went to Hallmark, in the 90s, which in 2008 became the target of the largest ever beef recall in US history for mistreating down cows. But in the 90s, I was going throughout California, and I came to this one stockyard in the Central Valley, and there was this down cow left in the parking lot. And I took a picture of that cow and continued, going to other slaughterhouses and places and documenting, but I couldn't stop thinking about that one cow. So I went back a couple of hours later, and it was starting to get dark, and she was still there, moaning in the parking lot. And so I called the police, who came out, and we talked to the stockyard manager, and they refused to humanely euthanize the cow because she was supposed to be sent to slaughter the next day. And that was generally what the issue was, is that these animals were still considered to be commodities. They could still be sent to slaughter to be sold for human food. And therefore, the stockyard was unwilling to euthanize them because they could make a couple of $100s. And so that was fundamentally the issue, that these animals were still commodities. And we had another case in Pennsylvania, also in the 90s, where we actually incorporated, Farm Sanctuary Incorporated is a law enforcement agency, because local humane societies and local law enforcement wouldn't do anything about this. So we incorporated as an SPCA, and our agent came across a down cow at Lancaster Stockyards in Pennsylvania. And the stockyard had told us they had a no downer policy, that these animals would be euthanized, but they failed to do that. And the reason was they said that this cow was going to be sent to a slaughterhouse and had already been purchased, and they were not able to euthanize. So we called a veterinarian who actually came to the stockyard, saw this cow was in horrible shape, and to his credit, he euthanized this cow. And then the stockyard sent us a bill saying that cow was worth a few $100s. And we did not pay the bill, and instead charged them with cruelty, and they were ultimately convicted of cruelty. So that was a significant legal victory. But we've continued these kinds of things, and eventually we were able to achieve a federal ban on slaughtering down cows for human food. And we did that through litigation. We argued that downed animals are diseased, and it's illegal for diseased animals to be used for food. The USDA disagreed with us, and they said it's common for diseased animals to be used for human food. So we sued them, and we were in court arguing that down cows might have mad cow disease, and they kept saying, oh, there's no evidence of that. But then they discovered mad cow disease in a down cow, and they came to talk to our lawyers, and they agreed, okay, no more down cows in the food supply. So that's how we were able to achieve that in the early 2000s. And we're still working to prevent other downed animals, like pigs, for example, from going into the food supply. So it's an ongoing process. We argue from a humane standpoint, but also from a human health standpoint, which ultimately is how we won the down cow ban.
That's what I wanted to ask. What are the dangers to humans' consumption of? I'm assuming they're down for a variety of different reasons. But
Yes.
What would be the ones that are dangerous for human consumption that you argue?
Well, farm animals in the US are routinely sick, and they are routinely diseased. There's a disease called Johne's disease in cows, for example, that is very common on dairies. And the human counterpart to that is Crohn's disease. And some of the same pathogens in cows with Johne's have been identified in humans with Crohn's. And there's speculation that there might be some connection. Unfortunately, when it comes to diseases in farm animals and how they might affect humans, there's a vested interest in not looking very carefully. When we were arguing that down cows might have mad cow disease, one of the things we said was that the USDA and the industry were taking a don't look, don't find approach. And I really believe that's the case.
Yeah.
There was evidence that we had a variant of mad cow disease in the US since the 1990s. We provided this to the USDA. It was part of our litigation. They said there is no such evidence. And during our court case, our efforts had been dismissed a couple of times for standing, but we finally won a case and on standing, and we would have been allowed to go forward and collect evidence and do discovery. Within 2 weeks of that victory, the USDA found mad cow disease in the down cow. Now, it's possible that that was completely coincidental, or it is also possible that maybe they knew some things and those things were not made available until they knew that through discovery, it would have been made available. So I think there's an awful lot in terms of illnesses animals have that the industry is really trying to hide from us. Mad cow disease being one, Johne's disease being another, but also when you have a downed animal on the ground, they're more likely to be covered with feces, which then is more likely to get into the slaughterhouse and onto meat. So that's another reason why downed animals entering the food supply is not a good idea, in addition to whatever disease they may have.
And why they suggest for us to cook all of our food at an unreasonably high temperature to kill it all. Yeah.
Exactly, that's right. I mean, I think the advice now is just to assume that if you're eating meat, that it has fecal contamination.
Yeah.
So increasingly, these pathogens are evolving. They're becoming resistant to antibiotics because so many antibiotics are used in the food system. So that's why they say cook it, because you got to cook the pathogens so they're no longer as dangerous.
Yeah.
Speaking of health and meat, a lot of people will say, oh, but my meat is grass-fed, and so it's healthy. And the cows are happier. Can you talk to that?
Yes. It is very good that people are against factory farming and that there are now efforts to make things less bad in terms of how cows and other animals are treated. But sometimes labels like grass-fed, for example, sound a lot better than they are. And oftentimes animals who are grass-fed also end up in a feedlot before they're slaughtered. So this idea of grass-fed might only apply to a certain time in the animal's life and not throughout their life. And so I think many of these labels like grass-fed or cage-free or free range or free roaming are more marketing terms than accurate descriptions. And so I think the only way to really know how animals are treated is to actually visit the farms and observe. And that can even be a little bit tricky because sometimes farms will have several locations and they might have one that looks much better than others. But the closer a consumer is generally to the source of their food, the better, because the more accountability there will be, and the more difficult it is for the food retailer or salesperson to mislead the consumer. This is why I'm such a big fan of like farmers markets and community supported agriculture programs where people get to know their farms and I would of course promote plant-based only, but even if people were buying animal products from those types of farms, they would be more likely to hold the farmer accountable to certain standards.
In terms of you mentioned eggs, same thing. People feel good about buying eggs from that are, say, pasture raised and stuff. But isn't the egg industry inherently cruel? even if you're just plucking an egg every so often from a chicken because of where they get the hatchlings from and the stress on the animal. Talk to us about that. If someone were to come to you and say, aren't I doing a good thing? What would you say?
I think that it all boils down to our relationship with other animals. Is our relationship based on mutuality and respect, or is it based on extraction? And this idea that we're entitled to their eggs or their milk or their bodies and their muscles for meat. So what is the relationship? Is it one of mutuality or one of extraction? And I'd say that in the case of the egg industry, chickens have been bred to produce a lot of eggs. So, in the poultry industry, generally, you have two distinct types of chickens. You have your meat type birds who've been genetically bred to grow like 4 times faster and larger than normal for meat. And then you have your egg-laying breeds who've been genetically bred to put all of their calories, all of their feed energy into egg production. So at the hatcheries that hatch the egg-laying chickens, you have males and females. The females are used for egg production. The males are useless to the egg industry. They don't grow fast enough to be profitable for meat. So they're literally discarded. I've been to hatcheries and seen dumpsters full of these unwanted male chicks. So that's an inherent problem with the egg industry, are these unwanted male chicks. And then for the females, they have generally been put in these battery cages, packed so tightly they can't even stretch their wings. Now, thankfully, there have been a number of laws enacted to ban these battery cages to give animals more space in cage-free systems. So those are steps in a positive direction, but the relationships with these animals are still based on extraction and exploitation and seeing the animals as commodities, not as living, feeling animals. So that is fundamentally the problem in animal agriculture, is that the animals are commodities. Mm-hmm. Now, it might be conceivable that if, say, somebody were to rescue a hen from a battery cage operation or from the industry and allowed that hen to live with them as their friend, not their food, as the companion, and if that hen laid an egg from time to time, theoretically, that might be, ethical. Now, I hesitate in saying this because it becomes a slippery slope, and human beings are very adept at rationalizing things and saying, "Oh, that's fine." And a very important aspect of this whole conversation about relationships with other animals is power dynamics, and humans have power for the most part over other animals. And if we have a chicken that we're taking care of, in a sense, we have power. Mm-hmm. And so so mutuality within that dynamic is something we need to be very thoughtful about and not assume that, oh, they like this, because that's what somebody in power tends to do with somebody with less power, right? Mm-hmm. So when it comes to relationships with other creatures or even with other people for that matter, it's really about mutuality and being clear, what does that look like? And when we are exploiting animals for food, it's the opposite of that. And so can that be shifted? That's a question. And so the best answer, of course, is to eat plants instead of animals, to stay away from animal products. But mutuality to me is the primary goal there.
Mm-hmm. Just jumping off of that whole concept, we both think there's a resistance to going vegan and adopting a vegan diet because it's elitist, even though really, in reality, it's the meat that's linked to the rich and powerful. And I know just a few years ago, the New York City, there was a bill to ban fur, and it ended up at the very end getting thrown out by a group of folks that said, hold on a minute, it's actually our right to show our class in society by wearing fur because we're able to afford it. How do you think this confusion arose? As nowadays I think people think more of that vegan is some kind of elite diet, and it's really expensive and really hard to access when beans and potatoes and rice don't seem to be that hard to access even in food deserts.
a very interesting evolving area. And I think for me, being vegan is trying to work against systems of oppression and abuses of power. And oftentimes, when you're trying to challenge systems of oppression, one of the common tactics of those who hold power is divide and conquer. Mm-hmm. And so I think that when it comes to the vegan world, you know, our allies are those who understand oppression and want to stop it. Now, I think getting onto price issues and how vegan food can sometimes be expensive, you know, part of that is the marketplace and the fact that oftentimes vegans can afford more. So, you know, businesses are, if they can sell something for $5 instead of $2, they'll tend to do it. So there is, you know, a segment of the vegan marketplace that is somewhat well-to-do that is, I think, overspoken of. But if you look at history, you know, as you said, meat has been connected with elite, wealthy, powerful segments of societies throughout history. And that's why most ethnic foods, you know, Indian food, Ethiopian food, for example, tend to be primarily plant-based because most people eat plant foods because it's the most affordable. It's inherently more efficient. The wealthy and the elite tend to eat more meat because it requires more resources, more power to be able to get meat. Now, in our country, we have government subsidies that are completely upside down. So we are actually incentivizing the excess production of meat and dairy, which means that the price goes down. So it's completely backwards. And so this is where certain products may appear cheap, and they are cheap, but it's partly because of the economic system in place, which is dysfunctional. And so a big part of what I'm hoping starts happening in the coming years is that government programs that have enabled and perpetuated our dysfunctional, unhealthy, animal-based food system start being retooled and money taken away from those programs that support animal agriculture and instead put into programs that support plant-based agriculture. And, you know, when you grow plants and are close to where they're grown, it can be one of the cheapest, most efficient ways to feed ourselves as a society. Now, there's this guy in Los Angeles named Ron Finley. He says growing your own food is like printing your own money. And he actually does gardens in urban areas where there is a need for healthy food. And there are these community gardens popping up in various places now, which I think are very healthy. They're very empowering. It's a way for healthy food to be accessible in all kinds of communities. So I think that that kind of model needs to be encouraged. I think access to land for that type of urban farming needs to be more widely available. So that's a kind of a policy systemic solution to making food more accessible, especially where it's most needed. But this idea that the vegan movement is elite is something that's complex and multivalenced. And I think that fundamentally, the vegan movement is about stopping abuses of power and food systems that have perpetuated inequity. You know, I think, you know, it's a big issue. It's a really important one. And I think the vegan movement, and, you know, look, I'm a white man. I've been in the vegan movement for a long time, mainly in the white vegan movement, you know, but there's a much broader vegan movement that I'm frankly starting to learn more about. I mean, people like Dick Gregory, you know, was a vegan in the 1960s. Angela Davis has been a vegan for a long time too. So there's a much bigger movement, I think, than I've been aware of, and I'm learning about it. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity to align with and engage with more diverse communities around common goals of eating food that doesn't make us sick, supporting a food system that's not destroying the planet, and creating a system where food is accessible to everybody who needs it. Healthy, fresh, whole food, whole plant-based food. So, but you know, we're dealing with a dysfunctional marketplace right now, and a dysfunctional social systems as well. So there's a lot that we're dealing with here, a lot to unpack. But in terms of a broad principle, it's about dealing with systems of oppression and abuses of power. And how do we do that? And then creating relationships of mutuality instead of relationships of extraction, right? So those types of principles can apply in many different ways.
Farm Sanctuary started off as a rescue. Well, first, I guess y'all were a investigative organization. You became a rescue organization. You also educate and you advocate to change systems, like you mentioned. You acknowledge being a white man in a white movement, a largely white movement. What is Farm Sanctuary doing to for outreach to broaden our movement, which Dotsie and I have talked a lot about, the whiteness of the animal rights movement, whereas there have been so many people of color who understand even more, probably in a gut level, this cruelty and disenfranchisement that they feel in the system, from a system that's larger than them, like animals do.
Yes, it's a huge area, and it's an area that we are learning about. It's an area that we have done some things to support. Some years ago, we worked with Tracy McWhorter to do the African American Vegan Starter Guide. She put that together with a number of contributors. And I think for me, it's really finding common ground, finding opportunities to work together, while recognizing that there is a long history of white people with certain resources appropriating opportunities in communities who have been historically disenfranchised and mistreated. So it's an area we need to be, I think, very careful about and thoughtful about. And we're learning as we go. So we don't have any really concrete programs right now, other than to say that social justice, equity are important priorities for us to get right. And we're, a largely white organization still. And that is something that we are working to remedy.
What are some of the laws out there most recently that have been changed by the work that you've done, or ones that are upcoming that you are most proud of and really feel like is the new way forward?
Yeah, well, I've come to see how much money is spent by the government in agriculture.
Yeah.
Tens of billions of dollars every year. There was a study done, it came out in 2018, showing that 73% of dairy industry income came from government programs. So one of the first things I want to try to do is stop getting all that money that is perpetuating this harmful system, whether it's in dairy or other forms of animal agriculture or feed crops. I mean, there's a lot of money that goes into crop insurance to incentivize the mass production of corn and soy, for example, which means that the price of feed is lower than it should be. So the price of animal products is lower than it should be. So getting the money out of these bad things and then starting to get some resources into positive things. For example, urban agriculture. There was grants given for the first time last year in the amount of about $5 million for urban farming. And 5 million might sound like a lot to us, but to the industry, it's nothing. Another area is the food. It's Gus Shoemaker Nutrition Incentives Program, which doubles up the value of SNAP dollars when they're spent on fruits and vegetables. So it incentivizes that SNAP dollars be used to buy fruits and vegetables. And the support for that program has been increasing recently at USDA. That is positive. And those dollars can be spent at farmers markets.
Yeah.
And so when that happens, it doesn't only provide consumers with healthier food, it puts dollars into a food system that is healthier and can be more local and more sustainable. So that's another example of a positive program. And there's a lot of COVID relief money right now too that's going to be spent. And unfortunately, most of it so far is going to animal agriculture. So we're going to try to prevent that. and try to get it going more in the direction of a new food system. Instead of perpetuating the old system, maybe this is an opportunity to jumpstart a new system with this infusion of cash. And then also we have to be mindful of the greenwashing that will no doubt be on the horizon. So there's a lot of concern now about the climate crisis, which is appropriate. But what will likely happen is that industrial agriculture is going to try to get government money for carbon credits or for carbon trading that is actually not very good. And an example of this would be the methane digesters for factory farm animal waste, where they, take animal manure and turn it into energy. And on the surface, it might sound good, but in fact, it's an inherently inefficient system. You should prevent the factory farm manure in the first place. But investing in a system and in an infrastructure to take animal waste and turn it into energy incentivizes more animal waste and creates a dependency on this new machinery and this new dependency on waste for energy. So that's a problem. There's already been hundreds of millions that have gone into it in different places. So that's something we're worried about might be snuck into some climate efforts, is to give money to factory farms for methane digesters or for other programs that sound better than they are. So that's what we're watching. But there's more awareness now than ever. There are some good folks on the Agriculture Committee now, like Cory Booker, for example, is on the Senate Agriculture Committee. That's a good thing. But the Agriculture Committee has tended to be very sympathetic to animal agriculture and factory farming. So I think Senator Booker is going to have his work cut out for him, but he's up for it if anybody is.
Let's end with a story from you, please, about an animal whom you've rescued and who now lives or did live on one of your sanctuaries.
Yeah, no, it's, rescuing animals in some ways has been a way that we at Farm Sanctuary have been able to heal. After seeing so many horrible things, being able to, from time to time, rescue somebody and watch them heal helps for us to heal. Mm-hmm. And, I'm down in the Washington, D.C. area now and not doing regular shelter work or regular rescues, but I used to do that a lot. And one of the stories I often like to tell is about this calf who I found left for dead at a stockyard in upstate New York. He was a young day old, probably even just a couple of hours old. He was still wet from afterbirth, and he was born on a dairy farm. And probably what happened was that the farmer had a truck on its way to the auction. So he said, this one's just gotten born. I don't want to spend another week taking care of it. So send it off to the auction. So this calf comes to the auction, very weak, very frail, falls in the alleyway, and is basically left there to die. And so I went up to the stockyard worker and said, what's going on with this calf? He says, I've got to bury him later today. And I said, well, what if I take him off your hands? He said, sure, go ahead. So I took this calf, brought him to a nearby veterinarian, and she said, this calf has a very low chance of survival. It makes no economic sense. What are you wasting your time for? And so we had to go back and forth for a while. And I said, look, to me, this calf is not about economics. This is an individual. I want to do what I can to help. And she finally gave him intravenous fluids and treated him basically. So I brought him back to the sanctuary and was with him, 24 hours, not 24, but most of the time, there are a lot. And he started to recover. At first his eyes were sunken in, he was practically comatose, but then you could see the light starting to come into his eyes. Then he was able to lift his head. Then he was able to stand. And then he was able to suckle on a bottle. So he was going in a really good direction for the first few days, but he really wasn't thriving. And I was wondering, why isn't he happy and enjoying life? And then I realized what it was. He needed to be with his people. He needed to be with the cows. So I brought him out to the cow barn. And when I brought him out, man, they started mooing. He started mooing, and that was that. And that was Opie. He lived with us like 18 years, man.
Oh, wow. Oh, God.
Yeah. So anyway, that was one of those.
We need our tribe.
Yeah, man. So yeah, so Opie is really amazing, and he ended up weighing like 3,000 pounds and had a good long life.
Those male Holsteins get rather big, don't they?
Oh man, they're huge. They're huge.
know.
Yeah, he was giant. But I think, one reason they get so big is that, these dairy cows have been genetically bred to produce so much milk, right? So to produce 10 times more milk than you normally would, you've got to be a big animal, right? With big bones. And so the males have those same genetics and they get huge. But yeah, Opie was, close to 3,000 pounds, just a beauty, man. And I loved going out to the barn and just seeing him. He was very peaceful. And, when he was a calf, he would run around and kick up his legs and stuff. But yeah, watching him heal and seeing how social these animals are was really, really something. And that was one of my favorite rescue stories.
That's beautiful. And you've written 2 books so people can learn more about living the sanctuary life, right?
That's right. That's right. My first book was called Farm Sanctuary, Changing Hearts and Minds About Animals and Food. And it's really more about kind of the investigations and the substance around these issues. That came out in 2008. My second book is called Living the Farm Sanctuary Life, that came out in 2015. And this was more of a how-to. It includes like 100 great vegan recipes, and it provides some background and some information, some really nice pictures of the farm and of really nice food. So that one was more of a how-to. And I'd love for people to check those out.
And did you do both with Gene Stone or just the second one?
Just the second one.
Yeah. He's a friend of ours. We're doing a book club with him right now. Tonight we're meeting. So
that's great. Say hi. He's out in LA now, right?
Yeah. He moved out like the month the pandemic started. So he's had a rough entry into life in LA because he's isolated. But yeah, we've done some hikes with him, Alexandra and I.
What kind of book are you looking at?
We're doing Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's taken us, we've been working on 2 months where you read and then you journal and then you discuss white privilege, white centeredness, white supremacy in ourselves. And it's
white fragility.
Fragility.
A new concept for me.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, right? I mean, I think that's where, for our movement, right? I mean, we want to prevent suffering, and we also grow up with certain lived experiences and blind spots, and just assumptions and there's many other kinds of lived experiences that are really intense, and there's real trauma, and we all have different kinds of trauma, but there's some systemic and structural trauma that it's important to really come to understand and learn about. And it's great that you guys are doing that work. So am I, and so are we at Farm Sanctuary. It's really important.
Yeah. Got to lean into it.
I think it gives me, it took me 33 years to go from vegetarian to vegan. And when I did, it did feel like a veil was lifted from my eyes. And it's the same thing after George Floyd. I always had been a very progressive white person, but I'd always been sort of a white savior type instead of, and still had lots of, not aware of my white privilege. And so it has felt like a veil has been taken off my eyes in the last year. And I've seen what I just never saw. Just like people who continue to eat meat don't see the depth and importance of not eating meat. So
yes. No, it's kind of a magical time, right? To kind of learn all this stuff and for these veils to be lifted. Did you ever read that book, Poisonwood Bible?
I know what you're talking. I've heard about it. Is it, you suggest it?
I really liked it. Yeah, it was, talk about like there's this white missionary guy in Africa to help those people, which is a disaster, right? So it's so often it's sort of this savior, right? Or this not necessarily ill-intended.
No, usually
but the
not.
result isn't always good, and sometimes it's horrible, So it's this is where humility is so important. Humility is so important, and just trying to understand and each of us do the best we can, and this is where mutuality is so important too, and also looking at power dynamics. I mean, that's for me a very big part of this too. And all of us, I think, have had certain privilege and power, right? And that is sort of taken for granted sometimes, and then it's a matter of understanding that, but then how can you use that in a good way those are interesting questions to think through, right? And it's going to be a community effort, right? And we got to do the work, but then also, engage with others and do the work somehow. It's an interesting time. I think it's a very positive time. And I think it's a time for bigger thinking and bigger systemic shifts in front of us. When we have a bigger audience with common interests, man, I think that's it. I think I get very excited to think about common interests again. And it's so basic, right? Food that doesn't make us sick, a food system that doesn't exploit other animals and people, and a food system that doesn't destroy the planet. I mean, everybody would like that, and clean air and gardens in the city, and anyway, and there's food not lawns, there's that kind of movement, so there's all kinds of like little threads of this that could lead to some amazing stuff.
We got to keep listening.
Yeah.
To people like you too. Thank you.
Well, no, we just all got to keep listening to each other. Exactly. Listening and learning and evolving.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jean, for being on Switch for Good. Dotsie and I really love speaking with you.
Yeah, it was great speaking with you too. And thanks so much for having me.
Hey folks. Okay. Back by very popular demand is our plant-powered plate fridge magnet, which you are going to receive for free if you leave us a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. So here are the details. Just write your quick review. Does not need to be long, does not need to be a whole story. Just be honest and speak from the heart. Then take a quick screenshot of the review you wrote and email it to us at podcast@switchforgood.org. That's podcast@switchforgood.org. And include your mailing address so we can send you a power plate. We are doing this because the more reviews we garner, the higher we go in search results, which means more folks will learn about our podcast. So the power is in your hands. Leave us a review, and zoom, your power plate arrives at your doorstep.
So thank you so much for tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the switch for good, please visit us at switchforgood.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to Switch for Good. This is the future.